I'd like to welcome you all tonight to our event. My name is Melanie Brooks, and I am the audience coordinator at the Bangor Daily News. I am joined tonight by my colleague, BDN editor Aislinn Sarnacki. It's always fun to have someone from the newsroom join in on these events. So thanks for being here for our event with author Eric Hendrickson. I want to kick off this event by thanking our event partner, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and our subscribers. This support from our subscribers and our event partners allow us to offer these events free, and it helps everybody learn something new. I always learn something new at these events. So how this event is going to go, Aislinn is going to kick off the event by asking our guest speaker some questions, and then Eric will share a presentation of some historic photos. So he'll be sharing his screen. If you have questions, and we hope that you do, please leave them in the chat box. And when I'm done introducing them, I'm going to send everybody a message in the chat box. If you don't see it, it's at the bottom of your screen, and it's a little speech bubble. So at the end of the event or throughout the event, if you have questions, I can moderate that and ask Eric on your behalf. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce my co-host and our guest speaker. Aislinn Sarnacki is the editor of Act Out. It's a section of the BDN that features stories, videos, and other cool content about a wide variety of outdoor activities, nature, and conservation. She produces a weekly column about hiking trails and other outdoor destinations throughout the state and has authored 3 hiking guidebooks. So thank you, Aislinn, for being with me tonight. Eric Hendrickson and his wife Elaine are both retired natural science educators who live in Presque Isle. Eric grew up in East Millinocket, and his father taught him to have an appreciation for the outdoors and to understand the value of associating cultural and natural history with the outdoors. So Eric advocated for the creation of the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, traveling to Washington, D.C. to share the aspects that made this area worth protecting with the Department of the Interior. He has been a leader for the monument and National Park Service staff regarding the history of this area, and he continues to this day to explore and work to tell the story of the past by examining the lands and the artifacts that he finds. So, welcome everybody, and I'm going to pass the baton over to Aislinn and take it away.
Hey everybody, it's great to see you all. It's always nice to be able to connect with readers, especially these days when you don't see so many people. So thank you for coming. And I have some questions to ask Eric. I actually interviewed Eric, I don't know, a few weeks back because I was writing about his book on the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument that focuses a lot on the history. And so some of these questions we've already gone over, but I thought you guys might be interested. First of all, Eric, I want to ask you, so what inspired you to write the book on Katahdin Woods and Waters? And I know when we talked initially, you mentioned that it had a little bit to do with some people's perception of the property and how that bothered you. So, yeah.
Well, the main thing, as retired, we've traveled a lot. We've visited national park facilities, perhaps 370 of them or so quite a few. And before we started doing that, I didn't really think that Katahdin Woods and Waters area was anything really special, until I started traveling and I found some parks that I really liked and talked to the people there, and they said that their park wasn't anything special. I think part of the problem that people have, or the perception that people have, is there's really nothing there, just a bunch of trees. Well, there's a lot of history there, there's a lot of geology, and besides that, many, many people have never seen a true forest. So people coming from New York City, Boston, or wherever, get a chance to see something that's special there. So I just got tired of hearing people say, there's nothing there, there's nothing that's worth it. And we're just so gosh darn used to looking at the forest that that's what we think. But people from away are amazed that there's so many trees and driving on dirt roads. And some people don't understand driving on dirt roads, which is another issue altogether. So the reason I did was to show that there are things there. There is a history, both culturally and natural history there that's important, and that a story that needs to be told to the American people.
Once you wanted to tell that story and you wanted to tell people like what's there, how did you go about exploring the monument and uncovering what's there? And when did that exploration start for you? And has it, I think it's still going, isn't it?
Oh, there is. I have a whole list of places to look. Well, one of the interesting things, we were working with the National Park regional archaeologists, and I mentioned to him that when I was a little guy, my dad worked for the Great Northern, and I was allowed to go with him. He was director of central personnel, and more or less able to wander wherever, as long as I stayed within a certain range. So I would wander the rivers when he'd do things, and I discovered a bunch of Native American artifacts on the river, quite a number of them, and I thought that was kind of neat. So I mentioned it to the archaeologist, and the archaeologist opened his notebook and pulled out a piece of paper, and out came the report of the artifacts that I discovered in 1959. So that's basically the first documented time that I got a chance to visit. I wasn't really that old then, but we gave them the Maine State Museum, got a chance to go with the archaeologists back again, and we've gone repeatedly since. Once Roxanne Quimby started purchasing the land, we discovered it was a pretty nice place to go in the fall. We don't hunt anymore, so it was a place that was where hunting didn't take place, and a place that was just kind of fun to explore. We went by bicycle at first, and we've traveled about 275 miles of different roads within the monument. And there are still roads that we haven't traveled. We do a lot by foot, and we ski and camp in the winter. So we go by snowshoe, by ski, by boat, by canoe, and just about any other mode that we can that's natural. We've done and taken groups around the loop. The loop is a real quick way to see the monument, but it's also, just as going around the park loop in Bar Harbor, there's an awful lot more to see than what's on the loop.
I'm curious, I wanted you to let people know kind of what your book entails and where they can purchase the book if they're interested in learning, well, in reading it.
Well, there's a lot of history there, and probably it goes back a lot longer than we would expect, because I talk a little bit about the bedrock geology, so you can understand what the lands look like. Spend some time on the glacier, because there's some special features that are associated with that. And then, of course, for a long time, it was the traditional lands of the Wabanaki people. And so up until modern times, but the book doesn't deal a whole lot with those things. And it deals mostly with the history starting around 1841 up to about 1919. And in 1919, all historic logging pretty much ended within the monument. And there are still a few remnants of camps that were there and historical places that there were. So what we've done is all the old maps that we find, every time we find an old map that has a lumber camp or a logging camp, and we go searching for that camp, and pretty typically the thing you find first are what are called barrel hoops, because all food came in barrels in varying sizes. And then you find other things. We've found snowplows, we've found tractor parts, we found a rifle, oxen yoke, horseshoes. So you find a wide variety of things. And one thing we do is we leave everything there. The book itself is not a guide how to find things. It's more or less what is there, so that people can have some idea of what they're seeing. There are some places that are close to the road, easy to get to, that are historic, you might not notice, that are very important also. So.
And can you talk about, also, you mentioned to me that you spoke with a number of people in the community to try to find things and worked with a bunch of people, including people at the Lumbermen's Museum. So you can talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've slowly collected pictures. The Lumbermen Museum is probably the greatest source of photos that we have. Bangor Library is tremendous. Millinocket Historic Society. And there are quite a few other places, Maine State Library, but I've collected a little over 800 photos, historic photos. Those would be photos that are prior to mostly 1915, that range down to about 1840. We have a tremendous number of maps. One of the things that has surprised me I have a Dropbox where I keep files that we share with other people who are doing research, and occasionally I'll see files that pop up there that somebody put in because they knew that I was collecting papers. I've turned the Dropbox key over to the National Park Service. They have most of those things. But what we do is when we find something in the forest, a lot of times you find something that's broken or a piece of it, and you bring it back and you really want to know what it looks like. The Lumberman's Museum in Patton has most of those artifacts that people have collected over the years, and so we can match them up. And by matching them up, it allows us to see what it was like and sometimes go back. We don't use metal detectors. We don't use ground penetrating radar. We mostly surface look. So the best hunting season for finding things is pretty typically in the early spring before the leaves come, and from now until snow comes. And once snow comes, or just before snow comes, all the swamps are frozen, so that allows us to get around pretty well. But there aren't many places that we haven't visited in the monument. We use a thing called an InReach. It's a small personal locator beacon. The superintendent of the monument is on my InReach. So every time I go a place, I push a button and he can say, if he's interested in something, I know you've been to such and such a place. Can you give us some information what's there, if it's worth looking at or not? So we've acted as a resource in that fashion. But the archaeologists, they're kind of fun to go with because they do digs, and we've done several digs with them, and it's pretty amazing what there is to find.
And where can your books at the Lumberman's Museum, right? Are there?
Because of COVID, I don't do book signings pretty typically. I sign a couple, 300 or 400 because they're in the museum and at Shin Pond Village, the Red Moose in Millinocket. I understand in Bangor, they're in a couple different stores. They're in the bigger bookstores. So it's kind of slowly getting around. The book is. It's sold out of Amazon twice already, which I thought was pretty neat. And Books A Million is sold out of once. So I think that's kind of cool. People complain they can't get the books, which I think is kind of neat.
I mean, it shows how much that people really want to know about the monument, or a lot of people. Have you gotten a lot of good feedback from people? And
some got a little bit of hate mail, but I guess that comes with everything.
Yes, it does.
There was a kind of a squabble that I had I was mentioning with the editor. I sent the book in and they wanted 18,000 words. I wanted 100,000 words, which is kind of a difference that you can't really compromise. And so the first editor that I went to sent it to another publisher, and they published the book, and they wanted 128 pages because it's kind of a special number. And so I had 128, but they wanted more in it. So I wrote more, the purchase process and some of the other processes, and end up being 192 pages. So I said that you can cut it down to 128 because I can't. And they left it at that, which I thought was pretty good. There were some of the pictures I sent in they didn't like. There were others that they did like, and some that weren't completely clear, but they have an important story. And a couple of the ones I used tonight aren't completely clear, but they're the only available photos of that period and of that place. So sometimes you have to take poor quality for something that I think is important. I've met a lot of people along the way, and I do on Facebook, Katahdin Woods and Waters history. A daily, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, something pops up, and from that, people have started sending me pictures. And I've got a tremendous number of pictures, old family pictures and old family stories, and so-and-so's uncle was named after this, and my great-grandfather died in the river drive here. And so I've gotten a lot of stories that way, which is important too, because they have a story to tell.
Well, let's dive right into, you have a presentation for us with photos, and I am excited to see them. So let's dive right into it.
Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. We said that it's bedrock, it's important, the glacier is important. It was the traditional lands of the Wabanaki people. To give you some facts about Maine and the monument, in 1900, there were 70,000 men working in the woods. That was a full 10% of the total population of the state of Maine. There were 22,000 horses working in the woods and 3,000 oxen. So that gives you an idea of how important logging was at the time. By the turn of the 1700s, they'd logged along the shore and were moving inwards. By 1820, they'd logged all the way around what's now the Monument and Baxter State Park. They'd gone up the West Branch, they'd done the Allagash, up the East Branch. But what they hadn't done is the center part, which is where most of the monument is. So from 1841 to 1843, there was the Reed operation. That was an operation out of Mattawamkeag. And they cut pine, tall pine, and they were unable to get any pine down the river. And so all the logging operations made absolutely no money at all. Then in 1883, it changed hands. Tracy and Love took it over and changed to spruce, long log spruce. They did some modifications to all the rivers around in the area and got quite a bit out of it. In 1891 to about 1901, there was Eyre and Rogers, and different Eyre. They were loggers pretty typically out of Patton. 1901 to 1914 was a man named Edward Draper, and that was the beginning of the Great Northern Paper, Katahdin Pulp and Paper. And finally, the last few years, 1914 through 1919, the Lincoln Pulpwood Company took it over. And I'll get into why it disappeared in just a moment. But what we have, let's see. What we have, there were some fires that made the monument special. Were really 3 fires. In 1825, I don't have it on here, but the largest wildfire in North America, still to date, took place on October 7th. On October 7th, there was heavy winds along the coast of New Brunswick. A wildfire took place, and it ended up burning 5 million acres in New Brunswick and 1 million acres in Maine in only 2 days. So I'll give you an idea how fast it went. It burned 5 towns flat. There were 184 people that died. The whole sailing, a logging fleet that was in Miramichi Bay sank. That's now a national monument in Canada. So it was a pretty destructive fire. And in 1883, there was a windstorm that was called the Maine Cyclone. It happened in the fall. It was a late fall windstorm. And that windstorm pretty much flattened much of what would be the monument and a good part of Baxter. Those trees sat there over the winter. It was an early spring, very dry spring. There was no rain that happened. And what you can see is the location that's, I can see me circling, but location B here was where the fire started. And the fire started at Norway Falls. There were some fishermen there, built a campfire. They wanted smoke to get rid of the mosquitoes. And the problem was that they let the fire get away from them. Ended up burning 22,000 acres in a single fire over a period of about 4 days. And at the time, it was the second largest fire in the state of Maine ever. Those logs, they tried to log immediately to get the standing logs, because if you know anything about forestry, you realize that cutting logs that are burned, they only have a few years before the insects get to them and they start to rot. So the trees stood there and they dried, got drier and drier. They left the slash because of old lumbering practices. And in 1903, there was a fire that was even worse. On June 3rd, in 1903, there was a fire. It was kind of the perfect location, or excuse me, perfect storm. They had dry fuel. There was lots of wind. And the fuel itself was extremely dry. Operating in Webster Stream, deep in Baxter State Park, some people who were laying phone lines emptied a pipe, according to forest reports, and that pipe caught fire, and the wind blew the fire down through what's called Pogey Notch. And as it burned, as it blew, it burned, producing basically a fire that burned all of the monument in about a third of Baxter State Park. It started burning on June 5th in earnest, and then it was completely out by June 9th. Ended up burning, as I said, most of the monument. And while people think that that's a terrible thing, it was, at the time, the second largest wildfire fire, and still is the second largest fire that's ever been in the state of Maine, single fire. Burned only a few days, but burned pretty much the monument and large part of Baxter. That logging, they still logged. They rebuilt all their camps. They rebuilt all their dams that they had because they were all burned flat. And they went about cutting the burned logs. The next fire was in 1915 in the Wissahickok Valley. And that fire burned the edges, a couple of heavy snows with quick melts, flushed the river out, and really the Lincoln Pulpwood Company did a little bit of cutting around the peripheral, but really didn't make much money. So they, in 1919, it really ended. Logging didn't come back until after World War II in this area with the Great Northern. And as it moved further north, they put bridges and roads in. I'm sorry. This is a picture taken in 1884. This picture is taken on the edge of the monument, not far from the East Branch of Penobscot. And what's unique here, it's a winter picture. And you can see where that fire, where the edges of the fire burned. It burned up into Baxter, burned it pretty flat. And what you see there is a heavily forested area. So while we talk about old growth in the monument, there were a few what they call green woods. Those were places that didn't burn. There was a swamp by Orin Falls. There was a place by Lunksous Mountain, and a couple other small places that didn't burn. So all old growth that would be in the monument, or that part of Baxter, basically dates back to around 1910 after the trees started growing after the 1903 fire. By the way, that 1903 fire led to Maine building fire towers, and in the monument there are several of them. Lunksous, which was the headquarters, became very quickly, in conjunction with the University of Maine, a center of fire protection and fire observations. So it was a pretty important location. The next picture we had was taken by Francis Willard Hardy. He was a Bangor artist. He traveled quite a bit, and it's the only known early picture of the Hunt Farm. The Hunt Farm was a special place. When they first surveyed the monument in 1793, 94, it was because there was a gentleman from Boston, Birmingham, that wanted to buy 1 million acres in northern Maine. So he wanted a survey before he purchased it. And what he ended up finding out, it wasn't 1 million acres that he wanted to buy, it was almost 7 million acres. So having the money to purchase 1 million acres and having the money to purchase 7 million acres was quite a bit of difference. But what that survey did is leave some good information, because the surveyor's notes says what's there. And what the Hunt Farm is, the Hunt Farm was from the glacial period, a glacial delta. It's very flat, it's very fertile, and it was a place that they picked out to build a house. In 1833, William Hunt and his friend Hiram Dacey went to Patton, followed Amos Patton's road into the Savoyce River, floated down the river, and his friend Hiram took the first lot that was in the township that William Hunt had purchased from his brother Charles. That lot, in the surveyor's notes, said that the hops, the wild hops, were growing as though they were cultivated there. We now know that they weren't hops. What they were ground nuts, and they're still there today. But that was the second of the two major farms. The Hunt Farm cleared close to 100 acres. They had a sawmill. They cut boards. One of the things that they say about the Dacey place, which is what Lunksous is currently, that the house was built with no nails. And a lot of people think that's a special thing. But if you look at some of the old buildings, what you find is none of them had nails. Nails were too heavy to carry. So what they did is they had to drill with them, drilled holes, and everything was pegged. But there was enough wood from the mill to build the house at the Dacey landing and enough for the hunt farms. The hunt farm became a major depot, a major crossing of the river. It's a glacial delta. It's slowly disappearing into the river. The farmhouse that you see there and the tree was a special tree that sat there for years. It washed into the river just prior to the 50s. The foundation of the house disappeared in the early 50s into the river with only a very small part of it remaining. One of the folklore tales was that he ran an inn there. It's one of several that are in with the monument. And that one day when nobody was there, he stored a little bit of rum down in the cellar for his guests. And he decided to try it. He tried a little bit too much. Woke up the next morning, not feeling real rosy, took an axe, the rest of the barrels, brought them out the dooryard, smashed them, and the place remained dry for the rest of its history. There are several things that I've done in the book when there's stories like that that really aren't grounded in good facts. I've always put that according to folklore, this is what happens. So this is the hunt farm in the early stages. The next stage we run into, there was a gentleman that had a tavern on the corner of the Aroostook Road where Sherman is right now. And he recognized the fact that this was a pretty prosperous place because the stagecoach, his tavern was a stagecoach stop. And by that period, people entering the wilderness would travel to Hunt Farm, and the Hunt Farm, which you see here, was the major location and the major hotel, the major depot. It's where the loggers got their hay and so forth, potatoes. The depots were important because the closer they could get the closer they get the food to the logging camps, the cheaper it was to transport it. So these places raised 2 crops of hay, potatoes, and a bunch of other things. This is in 1894, Patterson owned this. Patterson had this. But this was taken by a guy named Lucian Merrill. It's in the collection at the Bangor Public Library. And it was one of his photos that he took on his trips. It's almost to the point where the buildings were falling down and they were getting ready to be abandoned. The building was sold to a man named Simon Gates. Simon Gates owned a big hotel called the Katahdin Hotel in Wynn. He bought the Mattawamkeag Hotel. He tried to buy the Tracy House, which was a hotel at the beginning of the Swift Brook Road. And he bought Hunt Farm. And what he had was he ran the stagecoach and he wanted a string of hotels so he could take people from one to the other and kind of prosper. So he built this house on the edge of the river, on the bluff overlooking it. It was a pretty classy hotel at the time. And he sold Patterson, or rented Patterson, Dacey Place. And so Dacey Place, or Dacey Landing, which is now Lunksoos, he leased it to him under the condition that he would have no recreational sports there at all. And he didn't. That was part of it. He could have the camp. He could do whatever he wanted. And Hiram Dacey had left years before. We'll get into that in a little bit. But one of the things that when Hunt came in there, Hunt brought when he first moved there, he left his wife in Carthage with 7 kids, or excuse me, eight children and a pregnant wife, left for a year, came back, brought her in here, had 2 kids that were raised here, sold it to Patterson because he wanted to work, but he didn't want to live here. So Simon Gates had sold it Patterson had sold it to Gates and moved upstream, couldn't build a building, so he went across the line and built what was called the Patterson House, because he was right on the edge of the property. And there was a guy named Charles Adam from Bangor that owned the property. So he leased the property and built a hotel there they called the Patterson House. The Patterson House was used as a logging headquarters for quite a while. And finally, they needed to enlarge it. At the time, he still had the property, the Patterson House, but there was a new logging crew coming in. And the logging crew run by a guy named Luther Rogers. He was a Civil War veteran. His son took this picture, Lord Rogers. And this was the Longsus house, kind of an interesting place. It went through several additions. It had 3 floors on it. The first floor was for the food and the lounge. The second floor were rooms. The third floor, which is basically the attic, was where the workers lived. And then on the very top was kind of a place that they could sit. It was above the trees. The wind would blow. There wouldn't be any bugs. They could do whatever they wanted up there. And they had an incredible view of Katahdin. The kitchens moved to the ends. They put in 3 or 4 more cabins. And this was put here. And basically they cut a road that went from about halfway in the Swiftbrook Road to here. So people coming in would not have to go by Hunt Farm. And that he could basically put them out of business and make a living here. The rooms were heated with wood. They had kerosene and candle lanterns. All the wallpaper was birch bark. The furniture was made on site, beautiful. And one thing I think you can probably imagine, that in 1908, the place burned flat. It was replaced with a small cabin that looked like the one today, although the one today is different, but it was very similar. So with all that birch bark and everything, people didn't take real good care of. But one thing that they did have there was a ferry that went across. The ferry operated from 1892 to 1922 at the end of what they called the mountain road, the road that they'd cut so they didn't have to go by the Hunt Farm. They had this flat, they had what's called a cable ferry. The cable ferry had a cable that went across the river at about 45 degrees. So the current coming down would act like the wind on a sailboat and help to push the load across. The ferry that they had could take a 4-team horse, the wagon, and a complete load. Later on, it took trucks across. In the background, you can see part of Dacey Clearing. Just in the very upper right-hand corner, you can see the Longsus buildings. Longsus was so important that they put cribs, that's where they take a log, square log thing, fill it full of rocks in the middle of the river, and they anchored to a rock way up above, and they had a boom. Those are logs that float. They kept the pulp and logs floating down the river away from the camp so that the sports wouldn't have any problem or interference with logs. So it was pretty important. They also cut a road into Patton. The road into Patton comes out on what's called the Happy Corner Road. Happy Corner Road was because the loggers, when they're coming back, got to the end of the road, they knew where they were and they were happy to be home. So it's a kind of a different name. The ferry landing is still there today. The landing is kind of neat because most of the area is very, very shallow, except where the ferry landing was. And where the ferry landing is, you go out 4 or 5 feet and the water is almost over your head. So it was kind of a unique place. On the other side of this ferry was the first of many roads. This is the Wissahickok Tote Road. If you look at it, one wouldn't assume that it's a road. You might not even assume it's a trail, but this is what roads were. There was the Wissahickok Tote Road. The Appalachian Trail went off this road. The Keep Trail went off this road. The East Branch Tote Road that went up along the river went off this road. And for a period of time in the 30s, it was called the Stacyville Tote Road until there became another Stacyville Tote Road. The wagons were special wagons. They didn't have any springs, but they were made of very flexible boards. This shows a wagon going over. They had a lot of times people who were passengers. They made them get off the wagon and walk, or if it was in a mud hole, pick it up. But the boards were flexible so that the wagon itself would be able to bounce. And they hauled it over. They say that in the 30s, that people could still see the rocks where the wagon wheels went over. We've looked, and we've looked and we've followed this road deep into Baxter, and you can still follow it today, and we're yet to find those rocks, but we will, just a matter of time. This is the first dam that there is on the Wasatacook. It was the first of 24 dams. Wasatacook was quite a place. It was difficult to drive. And so in 1883, when Tracy and Love came to log the area, the first thing that they did is they put a tremendous amount of money into the river. That tremendous amount of money was used to clear the river out. This is the Dacey Dam, had some gates. It's the entrance to a wooded gorge in the monument. It was rebuilt 4 times. It was burned twice, flat. You can see the cribs in the foreground, and you can also see the booms that are floating there where they collect the logs. All the logs that came down had a brand on them, and the brand identified who cut them or who the owner of the logs were. So when they got to the Argyle boom outside of Bangor, they were able to sort them into the correct ownership. This is the Reed Camp. It's one of the earlier camps. It's one of the first camps that was on the river. Pretty typical of a camp. They weren't particularly impressive. They were fairly large, but they held the men. The second camp that we have, this is called the Parker House. It's at the lower Katahdin crossing, just upstream from Dacey Dam. You see Dacey Mountain in the background. This is where the keep path crossed that went to Katahdin, where the first travelers from the east went. It was called Parker House as kind of a joke after the Parker House in Boston. Parker House in Boston is a kind of a famous, very high-class hotel. This was anything but a high-class hotel. One thing that they discovered early was that the loggers did most of the logging in the winter. And what they wanted to do was make money in the summer. So they rent these places to sports coming. But what they discovered very quickly was that the conditions that the sports expected and the conditions that the loggers lived in were totally different. So the sports really didn't like what they have. So this is, when they came in 1883, this is what they found. The long logs that were cut in 1841 were piled up all along the river. So what they did, and Todd had purchased this place. Todd was a lumberman from St. Stephen's. One of the interesting connections there is he smuggled wood from Canada into the United States, and that's how he made all his money. So in the early years of his smuggling, one of his chief smugglers was Benedict Arnold. So there's a connection there. But Tracy and Love, to clear the stream out, used several tons of dynamite. It was the first recorded use of explosives. They spent $4,000 and in the process lost 6 men clearing the stream of rocks to drive the logs down. This is a typical log crew. I threw a couple of these in just so you could see. If you look at the faces of some of them, they're pretty young. Some of them were sent from home. Some of them were from large families sent into the woods because the family couldn't feed them. They know if they came to the woods that they'd have a home. One of the things that you really have to admire the old loggers for, if somebody got hurt badly, a broken leg or something, and they were crippled, they weren't ejected from the camp. They were kept on the camp kind of as a bull cook to keep the cabin clean and the fire going and wood cut. But typically every crew had a picture taken, and most of the people are not named. So the only record they have of loggers are these pictures. The loggers were paid at the end of the drive or at the end of the season, and what was deducted from their pay was anything that they took from the store. So some of them worked a whole winter only to have nothing to show for it. This one is kind of a special camp. This is a real typical 1870, 1880 camp. Nice building, 2 chimneys. If you count the men and you count the horses and the oxen, they all lived in the same building. The horses and the oxen lived in one end. The men lived in the other end. They had a single bed, giant quilt. So when they went in there, typically they had what they could eat in the winter, which were beans. So they're dry, their clothes were drying. They were wet wool, beans for supper. They all live on the same bed with the animals in the back. So you can imagine what it was like for them. A lot of times they had a fireplace inside that was not attached to the chimney. You can see the tool of choice from Eddington, the PV. The men on the roof have it. Oxen were used, and most of them were raised in the Calais area, Machias area, off the sea marshes. They were used in the extremely steep terrain because they could haul things in places that horses couldn't. The horses were typically run by teamsters, and in these camps, the cook was the highest paid person. The blacksmith would be second. And today we still have roads there that were built by these guys. And the swampers who built the roads were the lowest paid and least skilled individuals. But they took great pride in building roads, as I say, are still there today. And if you've ever been to Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, you will have driven on roads that they constructed, and they're still there today. This is I apologize. This is a picture. This is a ride-out crew. They were river crews. The log cutters, who were the best, were allowed to work into the summer on the log drives. If you look at the feet in the bottom there, you can see the shoes had spikes, cocks. They did that because they walked on wet logs. These guys couldn't swim. They'd ride the logs down. Very dangerous job. If they died, and several of them did die, they simply buried them along the side of the river, took their boots because they're important, hung them on a tree, and carved their initials in a rock. This is Robar Dam and Robar camps. Probably one of the more important ones. It was a giant place. It was a swamp, the only swamp, large swampy area in the monument. And they had to build this to raise the water up 8 feet simply to get the logs through. This picture here I think is important because a lot of people look at Paul Bunyan with his oxen and his double-bitted axe. The double-bitted axe, which is the axe that's on the right, didn't come to Maine until 1900. It came from Michigan. Maine loggers used a one-end axe with a blunt end, and they used that blunt end because most of the dams were built with large spikes or large pegs, and they needed that back end to pound logs in. And of course, the crosscut. These men are dressed typical. A lot of times they put a coat in the winter over a horse, but the men just worked with a shirt on because they had plenty to keep them warm. This camp, I think, is important. This is one of the older camps. It's important because in the center there you see caribou antlers. They're holding caribou antlers. In the early years, there were a tremendous number of caribou in the area. They hunted them. And what the loggers discovered quickly was that if you shot a caribou, that the rest of the caribou would circle around the dead one. And they'd do that and stay as a herd, and the loggers were allowed or shot all of them, and that gave them their source of meat. But what happened by the turn of the century, 1900, the herds of caribou had completely disappeared. So this just gives you an idea. This is also a cabin that's built at the period of the gold rush in California. One of the things that the gold rush brought to the monument and all logging camps in Maine was tar paper, which was something that was a little different. And you can see the guys at the top. This is their sunny picture of the crew, so everybody know who it was. And they're clowning around just like people do today when you have a group picture taken. This last picture is kind of a special one because people have been here. This isn't in the monument. This is Shin Falls on Shin Brook, just outside of Shin Pond on the Route 159. But it gives you an idea of what the loggers did to get the logs down through. They built this crib work, this sluiceway, so that they could run logs over a seemingly impossible place and get them where they wanted safely. You can still go today to this place and many of these other places and see the drill marks that they put in the rocks, and some of the artifacts. If you have a good eye, you know how to find the artifacts.
That was great. I love the pictures of I like the group pictures of the loggers. That's so cool to see their outfits. And a lot of them were really young.
Some of them were, and some of the crews, every crew had a picture taken. It was their way of recording who was where. And many of them, the real young ones, the ones that are under 10, that were logging, were what were called cookies. They were basically a person that worked in the kitchen that hauled the lunch for the men and did the stuff. And as they got older, their goal was to be a cook, because that was where the most money was. But oftentimes they'd move into the woods. So if there was a large family and a lot of kids, a lot of times they'd ship them to the woods.
Well, I did want to, you mentioned there are some places where people can see things in the monument. And I know that's not what your book is about. It's not a guide, but you've been so many places in the monument that I thought maybe you could give us some of your favorite places that you think other people might enjoy that are pretty easily accessible.
Well, to kind of go through a few of them, as you enter the monument, there's Sandbank Campground. And just beyond that, there's a gate that lends you to the loop. There's a small trail off the side of that. And about 100 yards into that trail is if you look carefully, you can see the remnants of a dam. It was a splash dam built by Edward Draper. And that was the Sandbank Road. It was also the American Thread Road crossing. And the reason there's a cut through the esker there is because they needed to knock it down so they could get the wagons through. The American Thread Road came from Milo, and it was used to cut birch along the Wissahickok River to make spools. And Sandbank was a road that was built by Madison Tracy from Stacyville when Katahdin, they're thinking the Katahdin area might become a national park. And Stacyville wanted to position itself to be the entrance to that park, much to the chagrin of the Great Northern. Another place that you have is Lunksoos. There are a number of artifacts around Lunksoos. Lunksoos is a historical place because it's over 50 years old. There's a stone foundation there. That stone foundation is one of only 3 stone foundations that we've found. The stone foundations typically came with the explorers, the early explorers, because along the coast they made stone foundations. Once they started building log camps, they used cornerstones and only cornerstones. Another place that there is Haskell Deadwater. Haskell Deadwater is a big flat area that's along a trail. In that big flat area, they had to have a boom to narrow the river so the logs could float down through. So as you're there, if you step on any of the big rocks and look carefully, you'll see remnants of the boom where they drilled holes in the rocks and had metal pegs to hold the logs in place. Another one is the Hunt Farm itself. The Hunt Farm is loaded with different things there. And you can see where the old foundation was, an old foundation. There's a tractor tread there. There's some other things there. So those are the real common places. My favorite trail in the monument is up DC Mountain. It's a 5-mile hike. You got to cross the Wissahickok River. It goes through an old growth hemlock, the closest old growth hemlock that we have. And hemlock forests, if you don't know, they're the trees that can grow the oldest. These are typically 250 years old, but there's no undergrowth. The reason is because the soil is so acidic that nothing will grow there. But as you go by the watchman's cabin from the tower that was there, get to the top, there's one of the few ground house lookouts there. There's the food cache, excuse me, there's a watchman's dump on the trail. So that's a kind of a really neat hike to a place that gives you a nice view. My wife's favorite place in the monument now, she says, is the top of Lunksoos Mountain. She really likes that because that was the first place they tried to put a fire tower. But what it has is it has a really nice crop of lichen, reindeer lichen, and mosses that hang up the trees, and lots of little neat flowers that grow in the alpine that you wouldn't see anyplace else. And it's not traveled enough so that people have stomped it. And there's a kind of a little walkway that goes through it that's lined with stones so people stay off it, and a nice little sign that keeps you from going on it. But it offers you a really nice view in all directions of the monument in the eastern part of Baxter State Park. The other couple trails that are real nice with people there's one at Lynx Pond. Lynx Ponds has a platform that you can go out on. We had a group there the other day, and it was kind of neat. We watched a beaver haul a tree across the pond. So it's simply a beaver pond, but it's kind of neat. The other one that's right as you enter the monument is called the Deasy Pond Trail. It's a little bit longer, but it goes along at Esker. The Esker has some nice views, and Esker is an underground glacial river, if you don't know what it is. But it allows you to walk through the center of it where a place is washed out, and there's also a platform there that's pretty good for birding. And the other one is a very short trail that goes to a thing called Moose Pond. And Moose Pond is a full pond, correctly named, that has typically beavers. We've seen moose there. You see a number of other animals. A lot of people come to the monument, and what they're looking for are birds. I would never profess to being a birder. I know a few, and I know the rare ones that they come to look for. And there are a tremendous number of spruce grouse that are there. The other one that I find kind of neat is what's called a boreal chickadee. It's like a little chickadee, except it's got a brown head instead of a black head. And there's a pileated woodpeckers are there, and the black-backed woodpecker is another one. He has a yellow head, so it makes it kind of neat. So there are a wide variety of things to go there.
Our columnist Bob Duchesne actually just this week, his column is about birding in the monument, and yeah, that's pretty cool. I would love to see. I've never seen a boreal chickadee, but I would love to see one. I'm like a very novice birder, so I did want to ask, because we're moving into winter so quickly here. So for people who like to do winter sports, do you have any suggestions for things that you like to do in the monument in the winter?
There's much of the logging is done in the southern part in the winter, the road, so there's not access to the southern part. The northern part, which by the way is my favorite, it's an older forest and much more open, so when you're driving in you can see, is also excellent skiing. There's a lot of side trails. We typically snowshoe on some of the roads that branch off to the side. There's a road that goes out of the kiosk, that's the parking spot, to the foot of Billfish Mountain. And one of the neat things there is the camp on the side of the mountain had a stone house that they built for a well. And you can go up there when it's 10, 15 below zero and the water is gushing out and the steam comes out of the side of the mountain. So that's kind of neat. But the trail around the loop roads to Haskell Rock all the way to Bolin camps are kind of fun because it's a lot of animal tracks. It holds good snow. It's we ski there typically in April. I've skied there in May before, but that's not common. A lot of people would like to come to the monument in April and May. We get calls. I've had calls all the time to take people there, and it just doesn't happen in April because it's snow. May even snow. And this year it wasn't until early June that they even opened the gates. The same way it's the same conditions in Baxter. The reason they do that is to save the roads. So it's a really fun time to go this time of year, late because the leaves are gone. You can see a lot in the southern part, but as snows come, the northern part starts to open up, and there's a pretty nice parking lot there, and they maintain the ski trails so you can ski. They have huts so you can stay in the winter in a normal year. The huts, as many huts are around, are closed due to the craziness that's going on. Mm-hmm. And they will remain probably closed for at least another year.
Eric, Marie wants to know if you lead hikes in the National Monument.
I do. And
how would someone find out about one of your hikes, or someone else that would lead hikes?
Pretty typically, they go through the office and make a request. There are a number. When it first started, there were no rangers. There's some interpretive rangers now, and there's an interpretive ranger at the lookout. That's a place that's in the center to answer questions, and those guys are very knowledgeable. There's some other people who are in the office, but they have a contact station in Millinocket, and they have a contact station in Patton in normal times. And the people go through there and make requests. I do. Typically, we go down, work with Katahdin Learning Project. That's a group that's sponsored by Friends of Katahdin Woods and Water, and they do school groups. I did a book club the other day, which is kind of neat. They're neat people. And we did a after-school program the other day with kids. So quite often, and usually around, we always talk to people and answer their questions and try to promote the monument.
That's great. I will send out a follow-up email probably after the holiday weekend that includes links to your Facebook page, Eric, and links to your book. It's about that time, so I wanted to thank all of you for coming. Eric, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Those photos are amazing. I loved looking at the pictures of the loggers, like Aislinn said. It's amazing that you have such a wonderful collection. I think you said you had about 800 photos.
About 800, and I use those on a Facebook daily. I have kind of a 3 or 4 picture thing that I put up every day. It has a pretty good following, and people, it comes out the same time every day, so I think people read it like they read your newspaper.
That's wonderful. I'll be sure to share that link so that you all can check that out. We are hosting a webinar next week about climate change in Maine and Maine's outdoor winter recreation industry. So if any of you are interested in that, you can follow the BDN Events on Facebook. And we have another historic presentation coming up on the 20th with the Portland Marine Museum. So if you like learning about Maine history and seeing the wonderful historic photos that we have in several collections around Maine, feel free to join that one as well. It is almost 6 o'clock, so I wanted to say thank you for joining us. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Aislinn, for stepping in and joining us tonight. It was fascinating, and I hope that all of you have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you soon at a future event. Thank you all.